Hello, folks. Dr. Paul here with a video summary for Unit 3. We had the Monty Bobel article this unit, and this always is a great opportunity to talk about some very important points in family therapy. And the Bobel article is a great springboard for talking about those points and usually stirring a little bit of controversy because it's very highly charged situations that they're talking about, and people oftentimes get very passionate about the use of some of the techniques. So, first, to start out with, Monty Bobel trained at the Mental Research Institute, which you should be aware of your family therapy history. It was one of the hotbeds of the pioneers of family therapy. Don Jackson started the Mental Research Institute with Paul Watzlawick, John Weakland, Jay Haley was there for a while. Gregory Bateson was on the research team, not so much involved in clinical work, but doing research on families with schizophrenics. Anyway, so Monty Babel's training goes back to the Mental Research Institute, which is really seminal in terms of some of their ideas and the profound impact that they've had on our field. For those of you interested, no self-respecting family therapist hasn't read Change or doesn't plan to at some point, Principles of Problem Formation and Problem Resolution. This is by Paul Watzlawick, John Weakland, and Richard Fish, and it's a very theoretical book about their ideas regarding change, how it takes place in therapy. They studied the ideas of Milton Erickson, who is a hypnotherapist with some very innovative techniques in therapy, studied his work and came up with a very elegant way of conceptualizing problems. And then in their follow up book, which is much more clinically focused, The Tactics of Change, Doing Therapy Briefly, and that is by Fish, Weakland, and Lynn Siegel. So, two excellent books for those of you who want to read about some of the more foundational ideas in family therapy that, in many respects, are still very radical today. Um, First thing I want to have a little clarity around is this that idea of first and second order change. Um, this is a very deceptively simple idea, and the distinction between first and second order change, but there's oftentimes a lot of confusion, and I think it makes sense to kind of sit with and simmer with these ideas for a while before it kind of sinks in the distinction, because I see a lot of learners with confusion around this. Uh, just to give some other examples, so first order change, if I'm driving a standard shift automobile and I'm in first gear, as much as I push down on the gas, um, that is a first order change solution to going fast. And the only way to get more speed beyond putting the pedal to the metal, so to speak, is to do something very different. And as you shift into second gear, that act of shifting is a second order change. Another example that I've seen given is the difference between waking and dreaming. And you can do all sorts of things in your dream, um, but waking up from a dream is a second order change. Sometimes these ideas, again, you have to sit with them for a while. Let's look at something a little bit more clinically relevant. So we've got a kid that doesn't want to go to school. And as a therapist, you learn that mom has tried X, Y, Z, A, B, and C to get the kid to go to school. Bribery, punishments, rewards, begging, pleading, those can all be considered first order change attempts. Um, Potentially a second order change is to enlist dad, who stays peripheral to this whole interaction, to make it his responsibility to get kid off to school and make it mom's responsibility to back off. There's lots of examples of second order change within every example. Another one might be in this situation to encourage mom to um, have her kids stay home. Now, that will fly in the face of a parent who wants to send their kid off to school. So, the art of therapy, and that they detail very much in their writings, is helping people embrace sometimes very absurd solutions that will lead to a second order change, but suggesting to them in their sort of bare bones form can be very disrespectful. So you would not suggest to somebody who, say, was petrified of dogs that they should immerse themselves in dogs, for example, in a way that they would be very overwhelmed with that. At the same time, to suggest to them that they hang around some dogs and be very anxious at the same time, um, you want to just be careful that the thing that you are prescribing in terms of the second order change is something that can be accepted by the client. And that's where they talk a lot about frames and reframes and how a really effective reframe will make an absurd idea much more palatable to a client. So, first order change attempts, getting back to that, are change attempts. They're typically the advice that people get before they come to therapy. They're typically the advice that they're trying to give themselves. First order change attempts tend to be very logical, and they tend to be the thing that people have tried an awful lot of before they come to a therapist. It's unfortunate that many therapies perpetuate first order change attempts, and in doing so, get stuck in the same interactional patterns that the clients are in. So that's why the ideas of the MRI were so impactful because they had this idea of second order change, which really means a change of change. It's how are people trying to change a situation, and now let's get them to change how they're trying to change. And oftentimes, when you change, what you're doing is connecting with the stability of a situation. And again, in doing so, you find yourself thinking and maybe talking with clients in some very unusual ways because you really begin to question why they should change. And you become sort of the proponent of maybe there's a reason why things are the way they are. Or maybe there's some big lesson to learn about having your problem that in struggling with it will help you transcend. So, messages of stability are just as important, if not more important, than messages of change. It's very seductive to reach out and grab the messages or the requests for change from clients, but all clients bring messages of stability and change. And when we just acknowledge the change, we're usually going to find ourselves falling into some kind of first order change solution attempts, which more often than not people have already tried. Uh, Developing a second order brain or beginning to think in terms of second order change is not something that comes overnight. But again, I think the more you immerse yourself in case studies and if you're interested, reading about it more, I think it's an extremely beneficial thing to think about how we can use ourselves as instruments. The other important thing is when we are introducing first order change attempts, we tend to be the ones responsible for the change because it's our idea. And with second order change attempts, we're usually connecting with the stability of a situation in ways that when clients then react to that stability, they usually come up with the change attempts on their own. And so a lot of it has to do with who's going to own the changes. And as therapists, it's really good to be able to put your ego aside, and not feel like you have to be the one responsible for the change, but that you can trust that clients have within them the resources to change, even in the most dire situations. And as a therapist, that's something I firmly believe. Every client has the answers. It's not my job to give them those answers. It's my job to help them reveal them to themselves. This has been a guiding idea in my therapy since the very beginning because I'm very influenced by these folks and how they think. So, first and second order change. Another seminal idea with the MRI folks is that the problems people come into therapy with um, are not their target of intervention, but they look at the solution attempts. And solution attempts usually can be characterized as more of the same. So, if our solution to trying to lose weight is to go on a diet, then we're going to keep trying different diets with the idea that one of those diets is going to be the key to us losing weight. And those are more the same, more the same, more the same kind of change attempts. If we are parenting a child and let's say the child is throwing temper tantrums, and our solution attempt is to try to get the tantrums to stop, whether we reward, punish, bribe, beg, whatever. all of our solution attempts can be categorized as more of the same, trying to get tantrums to stop. When we step out of more of the same, we get back to this idea of first and second order change. When we stop doing more of the same and we begin to question our change attempts, we might begin to look at how temper tantrums can be framed to have a different meaning in the context of this family. So rather than them being this thing that needs to stop, much like the tumor that needs to be cut out, how can a temper tantrum be looked at as a sign that a family or a relationship needs to evolve? And with different framings of temper tantrums, people are freed up to experiment with different ways of behaving around them. Again, these are very delicate, subtle, complex ideas. You're not expected to wrap your brain around them completely at this point. But again, if you're interested in reading more, there's lots of good stuff out there. So, paradox, prescribing the symptom and joining with stability. These are all various ways of describing how to induce a second order change. And in the Babel article, we had some very interesting situations with respect to therapists who were providing a lot of more of the same. A lot of more of the same solution attempts. And so the therapeutic team spent a lot of time analyzing those solution attempts and were able to see that trying to get this woman who was trying to break away from this man who was potentially putting her in dangerous situations and abusing her, trying to convince her to leave him was pretty much how all the solution attempts could be thrown into that bucket of you should leave him. And what they did is say, well, how do we step out of that frame? How do we step out of more of the same of you really need to leave him? And it's really, some of you had talked about, well, they need to connect with her and empathize with her. These are extremely skilled clinicians that know how to do that very well and give a lot of thought to what does it look like to connect with her reality in such a way that could free her up. Now, I think it's important to remember the therapist did not create the dangerous situation. This situation existed before they stumbled onto the scene. They did not tell her to stand in front of the loaded gun necessarily. They certainly implied that might be necessary to prove her love. But that's exactly where this woman was to begin with. It's almost like they named the big elephant in the room. But I think that's an important point. They didn't create the dangerous situation. And they could make a really good case that by trying to remove her and do more of the same like everybody else was trying to, they were really just pushing her more toward being in that dangerous situation. And so I think a lot of you correctly identified that this is not necessarily an approach to use in a situation like this without a lot of consultation, without maybe the use of a team. But this exact dilemma that this therapy team is in is the exact dilemma that all of us are in as therapists with every case. These cases are just very highly charged, dangerous situations, but the idea of more of the same solution attempts being applied and how can we creatively think about cases in ways that we can connect with stability and maybe shoot for more of a second order change, that applies to every case you'll ever see. These are just some very dramatic examples of that. When you suggest to people to go deeper into their problem, to continue with their problem, if I suggest to a couple that I think they should, they're struggling with having arguments all the time, and I suggest that they go home and spend a half hour every night engaged in a particular argument. That's sometimes known as paradox or prescribing the symptom. Some people in pop culture would call that reverse psychology, but there is a systemic logic to prescribing the symptom or pacing or joining with the stability of a system. Not so much that you're so intentional that I'm going to paradox them or I'm going to suggest they keep doing their problem so it frees them from their problem. I think you can use paradox in that way. But a much more effective way is to come from the intention that I'm going to connect with people on a very deep level and I'm going to, with them, be with their problem. and maybe not suggest changes, and maybe even find some very good reasons of why change shouldn't occur. Not for the intention that that's going to move them to a change, but to really honor and respect the stability of their entire situation. So, a lot of the same behaviors, but a different therapeutic intention. Um, and what we typically find when we are very aligned with the stability, and even prescribe sometimes symptoms or problems, is that it helps free people from them. Um, and so, valuable ideas, regardless of the context that you're working in. Again, like I mentioned, many of you pointed out about the teamwork. Um, don't dismiss these ideas because you're not working in a context that has a team, because the basic ideas of more of the same first order solution attempts, um, one of the things we should always be asking as therapists is, so what have you done to attempt to solve the problem? And learning about attempted solutions will key us into interactional patterns and themes that keep repeating over and over. And that will help us to frame some solution attempts that might be outside of that more of the same framework. Domestic violence, we had a role play to watch. Just briefly, there's a lot of controversy in the field of domestic violence when it comes to, do you see a couple together or do you see them individually? And depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. The individual perspective is that there are perpetrators and victims, and they need to be separate, and they each need to work on their issues. And then, when and if they would be brought back together. The more systemic or relational notion is that you can label people perpetrators and victims, but from a systemic perspective, you just have behaviors that fit together. And that perspective is embraced by some therapists who think more systemically or relationally, but oftentimes it's a perspective that others in the system think is dangerous because they label certain parts of the system as good and certain parts of the system as bad. And so it's really a clashing of epistemologies. I think it makes sense for you to kind of think about where you want to fall on debates like this. Do you feel like people can be seen together in a abusive situation? And if so, can you make a case for why that makes sense, along with keeping it a safe context? Or does it make sense to separate people and sort of fix them individually? Um, there's this idea that, is abuse uh, an individual pathology? And so people who abuse are pathological in some way, maybe were abused themselves, very popular ideas in our culture. When we begin to think more relationally or systemically, though, we see again how behaviors are complementary in that they fit together. And so we start to see patterns or cycles of behavior. The more somebody does X, the more somebody does Y. And those behaviors fit together. And when you do that, some of the pathological labels fall away, and it frees you up to work with people in some very different ways. Just a point that came up reading some of the postings: we do not have to report domestic violence. It is not typically a reportable thing where we need to alert that somebody is being abused. Now, if one parent is abusing another parent in front of children, then I believe most states recognize that as child abuse, and so that would be reportable. Two parents where one or both are being abused in front of children. But that a husband or a wife or partners are abusing one another when there aren't children involved is not necessarily at all a reason to break confidentiality and make a mandated report. So just a point to clarify that. A couple of notes. Make sure that when you're submitting assignments, not the weekly discussion postings, but the assignments for the course, that you review the scoring guides. Sometimes there are some categories in the scoring guides that might make clearer what the assignment is about and what you should include. So make sure you look at the scoring guides before you design and submit your assignments. Be mindful of the due dates, and just respond that you have viewed this video and maybe think of one significant observation or something that you want to comment about that I said. Okay, great. Cheers.